Hello, welcome. It's time to get started. My name is Fred Keizer from the Faculty of Philosophy, and I'm here to introduce Thomas Metzinger, the speaker for today. I'm very pleased that he's here, but first I want to say a few things. First, we must thank the BCN Symposium tomorrow, because they were the agents in inviting him here. They asked us, who is your favorite philosopher to present at our BCN, that's Behavioral and Cognitive Neuroscience Symposium. And several of our faculty thought immediately about Thomas Metzinger, and this is the reason why he is here. So, thank BCN for that. We also want to thank Studium Generale for making this event so large-scaled as is going on here. So, and of course, well, I won't mention the Faculty of Philosophy because, but very important too. So, just sort of the official introduction of Thomas Metzinger. He's currently, I read this, Professor of Theoretical Philosophy at the Johannes Gutenberg Universiteit in Mainz. He is also an adjunct fellow at the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Study and director of the Neuroethics Research Unit in Mainz and of the Mind Group at the FIAS, the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies. His focus of research lies in analytical philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and philosophical aspects of the neuro and cognitive sciences, as well in connections between ethics, philosophy of mind, and anthropology. It's all many different hot topics coming together in the work he's doing. And I think he's best known for his book, Yeah, I was mixed. Yeah, it's the ego tunnel. But I think he's best known for his book, The Ego Tunnel, which is published in 2009. There's also a Dutch translation published by the Arbeiderspers. I've been told it is unclear how many paper copies there are still available, but they will publish it as an e-book shortly, or it's out already, I'm told. The other book that he is even more famous of, because is, at least among philosophers, is Being No One. It's very huge, almost 700 pages. When I saw it in 2003, I thought, I must read this. And then I looked at it, I cannot read this on my own. So I immediately gave a course with all kinds of students, so that's forced me to read the book. The course is called Being No One, of course. And we were so enthusiastic that we needed a sequel to get through the whole book, Being No Two, of course. So this was my impression of introduction to Thomas Metzinger. What I think is, what is most wonderful about his work is that he is so thought-provoking. And he doesn't like this, I think, but I want to compare him to Jerry Fodor. Jerry Fodor is a famous philosopher and psycholinguist, and he is well known for his outrageous ideas. He comes up with all kinds of things that you think of, this is silly, this cannot be true. And by doing so, he forces you to think more clearly about all kinds of pet theories and pet intuitions, and forces you to become clearer on them. And since then, the phrase has become well known as that you can learn a lot by jumping on Jerry. Jumping on Jerry is like a big mattress that allows you to jump higher and provides you with a better understanding of difficult topics. I think Thomas Metzinger does the same when it comes to looking at the implications of neuroscience for things that relates to ourselves, to who we are, what our self is, what our consciousness is, and also, and this will be the topic for today, what it means to be a religious person or a spiritual person, and whether this makes still any sense if you are a thorough naturalist. I want to welcome Thomas Metzinger.
So, can we jump on Fred afterwards? Thanks very much for the kind introduction. It was unfortunately not free of exaggerations, but I'm very flattered to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I think we live in a very unique and special historical time right now. In the outer world, there is a crisis coming to us, the climate catastrophe, that we know is still almost imperceptible to all of us as human beings, but which will stay with us for many centuries. And if you look at the facts, I think it is clear now, as I'm speaking right now, that the 2-degree goal can never be met. We're talking about 4 to 5 realistically, if one takes psychological factors and the political factors into account, not only the technology. So mankind has a big catastrophe in the outer world coming towards it, but also our image of ourselves is really changing quite dramatically. Genetics, evolutionary psychology, and modern neuroscience lead to something, if we want it or not, that I've called the naturalistic turn in the image of man. So somehow we begin to understand ourselves as fully natural human beings. It hurts us emotionally. 80% of mankind still live deeply anchored in metaphysical images of man and worldviews. It's a very critical situation. Our own image of ourselves changes very fast, and at the same time, by we, I mean humanity, it is possible that we fail with this planet in the next centuries. And one question I'm interested in is, what does one do in a transition period like this? Is there anything left? Is there an attitude one can take that maybe gets us through this historical transition period? An attitude or a way of looking at things that will maybe even carry you as an individual if mankind as a whole should fail in the coming centuries. And this lecture is a little bit also in the context of this question. But I want to ask, this is not a technical philosophical lecture. I will try to make everything as simple as possible. But I want to ask 3 questions, and I want to actually defend 3 claims. So I want to ask 3 simple questions. What is spirituality? What is intellectual honesty? Both mentioned in the title. And I want to know if there is a conceptual connection between those 2 attitudes, which one can have to one's own mind and to reality. But I also want to defend 3 claims tonight and discuss them with you afterwards. So the first thesis is that the opposite of religion is not science, but spirituality. The second claim is that the ethical principle of being intellectually honest can actually be analyzed as a special case of the spiritual stance. So this is like the core of the ethics of rationalism and science, is actually a spiritual affair. And I think that if you take the purest forms, the scientific and the spiritual stance are actually based on the same ethical norm. And that is what I want to look at tonight. But let us begin very shortly just with asking, what is spirituality? We need something like a working definition. One could, for instance, say, I see we have a problem with the resolution, right? Yes. You don't want it? Okay. We'll leave it as it is.
You can change the computer otherwise.
Huh?
You can change it over here.
You can change it?
We have to change it for the computer, but I hope it will work.
Yeah, it'll work. So you could say spirituality, it's a word about a property. It's a property of states of consciousness, for instance. There are spiritual states of consciousness, maybe in meditation, for instance, or in advanced spiritual practitioners. But today I want to look at it as a property of persons. So what would it mean to say that a person is a spiritual person? And I will not go into the history of philosophy, but just look at people who call themselves spiritual right now and today, who are spiritual practitioners. An epistemic stance, that is, episteme is the Greek word for knowledge. Spiritual people don't want to believe in anything, they want to know something. That is, they are looking for a specific form of knowledge. But what is this spiritual knowledge of? If one asks what are the objects of this form of knowledge, you get a theoretical mess. there are no clear concepts. If you ask different persons, some want to be in the pure white light, others want to see God, others want to see that there is no God, some want to discover their innermost self, others want to dissolve their self. It's not clear what the object of this form of knowledge is, but it has something to do with the knowledge that in the past religion and metaphysics were looking for. Right? In some sense it has that. For instance, there's often an idea of enlightenment, liberation, salvation. It's unclear whether there is something like a method of the spiritual stance, right? In a certain sense, spiritual practice means the ending of all methods, and there is nothing that can be taught. But on the other hand, you find many people who are very disciplined and engage in a certain practice, meditation, for instance. So I think in theory that's a big problem, but in practice both things are true. So we have spirituality as an attitude of persons where the relevant form of knowledge these people seek is not theoretical. That is, the question is not to have a good theory of anything. Also, the knowledge is not something that can be put into sentences. It is not something one can speak about. Every mystic will tell you, every advanced practitioner. It is not a question of having true sentences, and it also has nothing to do with thinking in a certain way and having concepts in your mind, right? And it's non-discursive. It is something you cannot communicate well. Those who talk don't know. Those who know don't talk. So you find that motive in many different ways. So I seem to definitely be somebody who talks here. But one can say a little more. It has to do with a form of self-knowledge that is an existential form of self-knowledge. And it has something to do with also changing oneself through knowing this thing to become whole, to become complete, to become healed in a certain way often, to become a coherent, a full human being in some sense. That is what you can extract. Of course, there is a Christian past, so there have been centuries of philosophical theories about what spirituality means. For instance, you have this old Christian quote here. In one of the Christian motives would, for instance, be that there is a difference between spirituality and brutality. So brutalitas is what it means to act according to your animal instincts, according to many Christian philosophers. And the opposite is spiritualitas. Brutalitas is what the brutes have. That's what the animals have. Spiritualitas in classical Christian philosophy will be something that only human beings have, for instance. And it has, of course, something to do with the original sin. But let us go into the last century and take one of the greatest spiritual teachers and anti-gurus, perhaps one of the greatest non-academic philosophers that has existed in the last centuries, Jiddu Krishnamurti. Now we really get a problem with the letters. Let me see if we should solve the problem, I guess. Is it that we should do something about it, because it will go on. It works on every computer in the world. That's what
She's very good.
Let's see. No, still not.
The third option, maybe?
FN F7?
How do you do that? No, how do you get the screen you had?
All right. You want to only projector?
No. When you switch to the computer, what did you do here?
This one? You want this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, one more. No, not.
Now, how do we look now? Oh, we're gone. And now we have the desktop only. This is the desktop, actually. Do you want to just let the thing recognize it one more time?
Maybe the laptop, die stil was. Dat is een andere stel blijkbaar niet.
So you wanted the bar again? This one? Is it better?
It's better, but it's not so.
Yeah, it doesn't take Shift F5. It doesn't take that. But let's do this. Oh, better. Thanks. So here's a quote on. Now we have a problem with red. That's amazing. Oh no, we've broken the red channel. So the most important thing is written here in red. Is this a pin in here? You see something? No, I don't see. Oh my God. Okay, I can read it to you. So, for I maintain that, and now the important part, the only spirituality is the incorruptibility of the self. Again, the only spirituality is the incorruptibility of the self, which is eternal, is the harmony between reason and love. So this is a philosophically interesting definition of spirituality. Incorruptibility of the self, which you can read there. That's what I'm interested in, right? Actually, this quote was made in Holland, in Ommen, in 1929, right? As maybe some of you know. So that's all we have to say about spirituality. Understanding what the concept of intellectual honesty means will take a little longer. So let's begin again trying to create a working definition. It's an ethical stance towards inner action. It has something to do with how one should think, right? Intellectually honest people are just people who are not ready to lie to themselves. In German we have this proverb, sich selbst was in die Tasche lügen. Is there anything like that in Dutch? To lie something into your own pocket? Do you have a proverb? Oh, okay. So it's an ethical stance not toward what you do, but toward what you think and towards what you believe. And it is about a certain form of moral integrity, but on the level of the intellect, not on the level of outer action. So here's one technical concept, then it'll be over, from philosophy. Philosophers call that doxastic auto-regulation. How you regulate what you actually accept to be true, what you believe in. So people who try to be intellectually honest try to achieve a coherence between what they actually know and what they believe. They try to not believe anything they don't really know. So intellectual honesty has to do with only having beliefs that are based on evidence and not to use thinking to feel well. Not to make up theories or spiritual models of reality or something in a way to satisfy your emotional need for security, for comfort. When you think it's not to in the end have good feelings, and that a theory gives you a good and deep feeling, is no criterion for that it is true or false. So I've brought, same thing again. The most interesting thing is invisible. That's amazing. So I'll read it to you. I've brought 4 little chunks from academic philosophy to you so that you see how this develops. So in the beginning, for instance, John Locke said, "He that believes without having any reason for believing may be in love with his own fancies," now the important thing, "but neither seeks truth as he ought, nor pays the obedience due to his maker." Because God wants the person to use those discerning faculties he has given him to keep him out of mistake and error. So this is already the end of the childhood belief. It's the idea, if there is a God, that God doesn't want us to believe in him. That's too silly and too cheap. That God wants us to try to know him directly. And if you don't try to know him, then you actually act like not as a good Christian, for instance. That's not a good relationship to God, to only believe in him. That was the first step. Then there was another step, Immanuel Kant. So he said the core of intellectual honesty was the sincere intention to be honest to yourself. And that is something you cannot fake, nobody looks. Either you want to be honest with yourself or you don't want to be. In Germany, we have an old-fashioned word, Lauterkeit. Does something like that exist in Dutch? Die Lauterkeit, the purity of the will not to fool yourself. And Kant said, and now here is the most important thing in red again, that is the idea of the moral good in its absolute purity. He said that's the deepest root of being a moral being, to have the pure wish to not lie to yourself, to at least be honest to yourself. Kant also told us what it means to be intellectually dishonest, to be not honest to yourself. And that's if you have a lack of truthfulness and sincerity toward yourself. So to be unaware, to be unconscious, to be automatic, would mean that you have a lack of conscience toward yourself then. So here, oh my God, it goes on. I should have never taken red. I should have taken. So I quote, "Man's duty to himself, regarded merely as a moral being, is truthfulness." So the idea is, you all have a duty to yourself, a moral obligation, and that's that's to be true to yourself. And here the most important sentence again: insincerity is mere lack of conscientiousness. To be dishonest to yourself is a lack of what we call Gewissenhaftigkeit in German, of having a conscience for yourself. That is, of purity in one's professions before one's inner judge. And this inner lie, although it is indeed contrary to man's duty to himself, gets the name of a frailty, as when a lover's wish to find only good qualities in his beloved blinds him to her obvious faults. Right? Let's move on. I hope there's no red. It's probably red. Stay with German philosophy in all its grandiosity. Friedrich Nietzsche was the first guy in the history of philosophy to explicitly speak of a conscience of thinking, an intellectual conscience, and that was the unconditional will to truth and the conscience behind the conscience. Oh my God, the whole thing is invisible. So I'll just read this to you. Huh? Shall I change it? What? No, it doesn't. If it, I don't know what you mean. You want it in working, not in presentation mode? Better not. I'll read it to you. Where my honesty ceases, I am blind, and I also want to be blind. But where I want to know, I also want to be honest, namely venomous, rigorous, vigorous, cruel, and inexorable. So it also has something to do with violence. And for him, intellectual honesty, that's an important point, is the culmination of the last step in the virtue of Greek Christian history of ideas, because it leads to the self-annihilation of the religious moral interpretation of the will to truth. What does that mean? Nietzsche says if you go through the whole history of mankind in religious and philosophical thinking, then in the end, if you're honest, you will see that you just do not know if God exists. And if you're honest to that, to yourself about that point, then you suddenly don't have this religious interpretation anymore. So first human beings had this impulse to be honest to God, right? Then honest to themselves because God was still in them as a witness in their conscience. And now in Nietzsche the idea is if you are really honest, you also see that you have no argument or no idea that God might exist. So then you have this pure intellectual honesty, the attempt to just be absolutely honest with yourself without having a religious interpretation of that will to knowledge. So now more red is coming. This is terrible. So in the, oh my God. So in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, all this was analytically deeper, right, than in Europe. And there was a British philosopher who founded something that is now called the ethics of belief, a discussion. And the first principle, I'm going to read it to you, is very simple. It is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone, to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. If you don't have evidence, you don't believe in it, right? That's a moral principle. And the second one is, at any time, at any place, and for every person, it is equally wrong to ignore or carelessly reject the relevant evidence for one's own belief. So it's dishonest if there's evidence on the table, for instance, from neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, or genetics, to dismiss this. This is a way of being unethical, right? You see where this goes? So he has this idea that we have an epistemic obligation to possess sufficient for evidence for all we believe, and we have a moral obligation, just like we have epistemic obligations. Anyway, I'm trying to run away to places where there are no red letters. So intellectual honesty, what could that mean today, right? So we have this general idea of being absolutely honest to yourself, but what does that mean today? And I have brought 3 concrete examples, because this point is so important that we have to make the point very concrete. So the first example is religion, the second example is life after death, and the third example is enlightenment. Let's look at them. So conceptually, religion, it's obvious, after 2,500 years, there is no convincing philosophical argument for the existence of God. There have been many attempts to prove the existence of God. Of course, there are technical debates in the philosophy of religion still going on, but we just have to face the fact there is not even a minimal consensus about professional philosophers that there's any argument for the existence of God, at least in Western philosophy. The existing proofs for God's existence fail, and then many people have this way of jumping out, okay, I'll be an agnostic, right? I will just say nothing about the existence of God. But this may not be so easy, because the burden of proof is always on those people who make a positive claim, the theists, those people who say God exists. But they have no argument, and they have no empirical evidence. So in a situation like that where somebody says the Easter bunny exists and there is no argument for it, it's also not so easy to just say, okay, I'll be an agnostic about the Easter bunny. You know, I'll just leave that question open for myself. This is actually not an honest attitude if all the burden is on one side in a debate. Then there's also a well-known fallacy, a logical fallacy that is in that context. Philosophers call this the argumentum ad ignorantiam. We know this for centuries, the argument from ignorance. It's a certain logical mistake that human beings very often make. So nobody has really proven that the Easter Bunny doesn't exist, so probably it exists, right? Nobody has really shown that ghosts don't exist, probably ghosts exist. Nobody has really shown that the climate catastrophe is coming, well, probably it doesn't come, right? Logically, it's a mistake, but psychologically, this is very close to us as human beings. So agnosticism may not work as well. How is it empirically? Of course, that's trivial. There is no empirical evidence for the existence of God, right? But what is new in 2012 is that there is a lot of research, scientific research now growing on the evolution of religion. We know more and more there are good theories about how religion might have evolved, right? Philosophers have written new books on it, but also evolutionary psychologists. So we have very first models of the development of metaphysical belief systems. Animals probably don't have them. In human beings, they have a history. There are two roots, shamanism and ancestral cults, still giving food to your dead people and communicating with them. Religion came out of there. And we learn more and more about the psychology of religion that we didn't know in the past. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. So what we now have in science, there is a movement that religion is being naturalized. The fact that human beings believe in God is itself seen as a natural property of human beings. This may be true or false, you don't have to believe it. Also, it doesn't touch the question about the existence of God, right? This is a separate issue, but one has to face the facts. So, here are some examples. This is, for instance, the most famous philosopher of consciousness who is alive still, Daniel Dennett. And these people write long papers and theories about how beliefs in something completely absurd could evolve. I mean, how is it possible that millions of human beings believe in things for which there is no rational argument and no empirical evidence? How could that happen? And there are some good theories. So one thing we learn today in 2012 is many people have this idea in evolution everything gets better, right? We see better, we hear better, representation of the reality becomes better in nervous systems, but that's not true. We now know that systematic misrepresentation actually was functionally adequate in many cases. To have wrong beliefs about reality in an evolutionary context very obviously sometimes had advantages. Just to give you some examples, 75% of all American college professors think they are better than average, although they know this cannot be true, right? All parents visually perceive their own children, if they just look at them, as more beautiful and as more intelligent than other people. Many people, maybe also in this room, believe that having children gives meaning to life, right? Or that having children makes you happy. You can empirically prove that's not the case, if you test it. People without children are a little more happy. Most of us have this idea that you can be permanently happy with members of the other sex. You just have to find the right one. It's clear that all these beliefs would have been evolutionarily very advantageous. It would have been good to believe something like this. And there are many other examples. For instance, 80% of all drivers, car drivers, think robustly that they are better than average car drivers. But this is also true of car drivers who've had 4 serious accidents and they were their own fault, They still believe afterwards that they are better than average drivers. So we have systematic biases, and the question is, how could something like an evolution of misbelief, of false belief have taken place? And there are first very interesting theories. This is Robert Trivers, the guy who invented sociobiology by writing 3 papers in the 70s, a genius in theoretical biology. And Bill von Hippel, a very good psychologist at the University of Brisbane. And part of their theory is self-deception evolved not because you want to repress negative facts about yourself, that's the standard theory, but because it's easier to fool other people when you deceive yourself. So take an example. If you are a politician and your job is to lie to thousands of people, you have to do that all the time, but these people are very good at cheater detection. You know, if you look at a politician, you look at subliminal body language signals. Is this guy lying or not? And the only way to efficiently lie to large groups of human beings is if you go into a delusional state, think of Goebbels or Hitler in big speeches, that while you talk, you actually believe that yourself, because then you have a coherent image. And there are biological data that show that you have self-deception in the animal kingdom. For instance, it's good to believe that you're the prettiest woman, you know, if you want to impress males. Male animals, if they threaten each other, in the moment you want to threaten another male, it's really good to be fully delusional and believe that you're stronger. You don't want to give off any signs, you know, of doubt about yourself. So you find this in courtship behavior and other forms of behavior in the animal kingdom. And the idea is human beings also use that to more effectively deceive each other. So Robert Trivers says the conventional view that natural selection favors nervous systems which produce ever more accurate images of the world must be a very naive view of mental evolution. New research shows that in many cases there was an evolution of systematic mental misrepresentations of reality. There seems to be something like an evolution of self-deception, and in many cases positive illusions, mechanisms of denial and repression, and delusional models of reality enhanced the reproductive success of our ancestors. That seems to be pretty obvious. So what is the biggest problem for our species? We have, it's red again. Oh my God. I should have. So the central problem for our species is that we have explicit and consciously experienced insight into our own mortality. That is, we are probably the first animals with our big frontal cortex that understand that their perspective is not infinite. They will die, right? And that is a big problem to us. It's a motivational problem to understand that it looks like everybody will die, and we will die, and there's no evidence for any sort of afterlife. This is very dangerous. It's a completely new situation. And the idea also I have myself is that religion is an adaptation to this new inner cognitive situation. You have to deal with the knowledge that you will die. Animals don't have to deal with that knowledge. Mostly they live just in the now. But we know whatever long-distance goals we have, what projects and perspectives we have, in the end, there will be nothing left, right? Before you were born, the whole universe was, of course, as if you had never existed. And pretty shortly afterwards, you have died. The whole universe will also be as if you have never existed. And human beings have to cope with that knowledge, that conscious knowledge, and the idea is that we evolved something that I call adaptive delusional systems, right? We evolved forms of self-deception where in groups we could deal with this terror of mortality. So here you have two representatives of delusional systems, right? But there's an interesting difference. I mean, National Socialism had a religious character in my country, very clearly. These people manage to sustain their existence for 2,000 years now. This delusional system, they wanted to be the 1000-jährige Reich. They wanted to be a 1000-year empire, but they only lasted 12 years. The difference is they have a very elaborate delusional system about life after death, and that you don't have to die. And communism, Stalinism, which has long perished, or National Socialism, didn't have to offer this. So some forms of delusion only work well in groups. Oh, I'm afraid, oh God, no red. Only the arrow is red, good. So the idea is that there is an evolution of adaptive delusional systems which hold large groups of human beings together, which, as many data show, stabilize internal hierarchies. If you think of the Catholic Church, for instance, religious organizations always stabilize existing systems of exploitation and oppression. And, this is all red again. So they offer a form of self-deception in groups which is functionally adequate. And the idea is that in the evolution of religion through burial rites, burial objects, ancestor cults, the main function, here in red, was to deny your own mortality, to offer people a belief system that allowed them to deny that they are mortal beings. Now, that's the second thing, life after death. Is there in 2012, any reason to believe in life after death? In current philosophy of mind, and that's really my field of research, there's practically nobody who believes in substance dualism. Almost no philosopher. They have very differing views, but nobody believes there is an immortal soul. You can read it all in the second volume of my textbook, Grundkurs Philosophie des Geistes. There are 9 different solutions to the mind-body problem, and they try to solve the mind-body problem. None of them is substance dualistic. There are property dualists. Like there are people who say that there are 2 kinds of properties, mental and bodily properties. And there are many anti-reductionists in modern philosophy of mind. But none of them argues for personal survival after death. You don't have to believe this. This is important. But that is just a fact. That's where we are right now. So what about empirically? You may know that I'm somebody, I founded this association for the scientific study of consciousness. I've also edited this book on neurocorrelates of consciousness with MIT Press. I know a lot of consciousness researchers. In the community of the more serious consciousness researchers on this planet, there's almost nobody who believes in a life after death. So the general idea is a functioning brain is necessary to have conscious experiences. And that means if that brain is dead, there will be no colors, there will be no conscious emotions, there will be no sounds, there will be no body experience. It's hardly anybody who still believes in the empirical researchers that consciousness could be something independent of the brain. And even if they are anti-reductionists, they believe if everything in the brain is fixed, everything in consciousness is fixed as well. So this research industry homes in on the neurocorrelates of consciousness. Everybody tries to find what the minimal correlate of conscious experience in the brain is. And I think it's obvious. If that's not completely misguided, there is no hope for life after death. What about enlightenment? This is a researcher, the director of Buddhist studies in Berkeley. I learned one thing from him. That in the whole history of Buddhist philosophy, at no point was there a consensus what enlightenment is. They never knew what it is in 2,500 years. There's just one group of people who know what enlightenment is. And that is Westerners who go to New Age bookstores to satisfy their emotional needs, right? By exploiting other cultures. So, conceptually, is there really any good argument that there is one well-defined state of consciousness, which is the enlightenment for meditators, which is culturally invariant? It's the same in Holland and in Japan or Burma, and which is independent of the theory and the kind of descriptions you use to describe this conscious experience. Is there something that we could say that is the enlightenment? What would be the criteria for it? It's obvious, we don't know. So empirically, there's a lot of good empirical meditation research. Helen Slagter in Amsterdam, for instance. So does empirical meditation research show that such a single state of salvation, of enlightenment, exists in advanced Tibetan monks? The question is, how could you show that experimentally with the methods of science? How would you do that? Show that all Tibetan monks have the same brain state or something like that? So the bottom line is, we simply do not know. If there is something like what my favorite meditation teacher has called giga bingo, you know? One moment you sit there and then afterwards everything is okay. Which brings me already to the third and final part of this talk. Now we have looked a bit what spiritual honesty is, spirituality is, we've looked a bit at intellectual honesty, and let us return to these three questions, especially the third question. Is there a conceptual connection? Is there an inner connection between these two things? If you remember Kant, with being honest to yourself, you may already have had an inkling that a very strict rationalistic position, and Kant was really a rationalist, has spiritual depth. So my three theses was the opposite of religion is not science but spirituality. The ethical principle of intellectual honesty can be analyzed as a special case of being spiritual. And in their purest forms, the scientific and the spiritual stance emerge from the same normative ideal. So let's go through it. Let's look at the first of these theses. Religion as the opposite of spirituality. You have fideism. Do you know what fideism is? Fideism is a position in theology or philosophy who says you can hold on to your faith without any arguments, even if there are counter-arguments or empirical evidence. It's okay to just keep on believing. There's also dogmatism. As a philosophical position, it means you can hold on to your belief just because you already have it, right? And that is, of course, classical religion, and it's the cultivation of a delusional system. In spirituality, you have a very different situation. Meditators, practitioners, they aim at knowledge, at insight. In religion, in having a certain faith, people maximize emotional profit. They want to feel as secure and as comforted as possible, at home in this world. They finally, I guess we all want that. That's deeply human, to try to feel at home. I hope there's nothing red, no. Spirituality searches for direct experience, right? Spiritual people want certain experiences. Religion sacrifices rationality to make the self model, to make your experiential self coherent. So you believe in something absolutely crazy for which there's no evidence, but the reward you get is a coherent, emotionally coherent self. Spiritual people always want to dissolve the conscious self, right? Just think of Buddhist practitioners, mystics of all religions, they want to dissolve it. So in religion you have dogmatism, which is very obviously intellectually dishonest, but in spirituality you have that ideal of truthfulness. Spiritual people, obviously, are always open for rational arguments. They don't discuss much, but they are open to arguments. Religions become organized and missionarized. But spirituality, I would claim, is a radically individual thing. It's only a thing for one human being and their life. There is nothing that can be organized about spirituality. So religion evangelizes, talks about it. Spiritual people typically don't talk, remain quiet. The second thesis was the ethical principle of intellectual honesty can be analyzed as a special case of the spiritual attitude. Let's compare it. Okay, spirituality wants insight and has a will to knowledge. All right? Science has a rational method and it maximizes epistemic progress, that it wants a growth of knowledge, right? Spirituality searches for direct experience. Scientists do experiments. They are data-driven. They search for empirical evidence. Spiritual people dissolve the phenomenal self, often. We've talked about this. Scientists like to make their own theories fail. They try to create an experiment that shows that a theory is wrong. That's the process of science. Falsifying hypotheses, right? So spiritual people have this ideal of truthfulness, and scientists have the principle of parsimony. Do you know what that is? You try to explain as much as possible with as little assumptions as possible, ecologically. So you try to minimize your assumption. Spirituality is radically individual. Science is a big organized enterprise. There are universities and things like that. They are quiet. Scientists actually go and talk about things in the public when they have results. So at the last example, there's red coming. As the last example, I want to show you Karl Popper, a philosopher who was a critical rationalist. And he said, if we want to be in touch with reality, he says, we are in touch with realities in the very moment when our theory fails. When we have a hypothesis and we falsify the theory. That is when we touch reality. Else, we're not in touch with reality. That's called critical rationalism. So you see, do you see the spiritual stance in it? The modesty? The spiritual stance also has something to do with being ascetic, to let things go, to let assumptions go. So here's this big red thing I have to read to you, and see if you understand the point. There's a sentence. I am not prepared to accept anything that cannot be defended by means of argument or experience. That's a principle. Now Popper says, it's easy to see that this principle of an uncritical rationalism is inconsistent, for since it cannot in turn be supported by argument or by experience, it implies that itself it should be discarded. That's what he said in 1945, right? That's the difference between rationalism and a self-critical rationalism. A self-critical rationalism knows that it cannot ultimately support the decision for science. So let's look at the last point. So I've said in their purest form, the scientific and the spiritual stance emerge from the same normative idea. What is that normative idea? Ethics is about what a good action is. But there are two kinds of action. So one is with the physical body, right? You walk and you talk and you lift things. That's bodily action. But there are other kinds of action. Acting with your mind only as you sit still. Mental action. For instance, if you think logically or you calculate numbers in your mind, that's mental action. If you plan what you're going to do tomorrow, if you visualize your last girlfriend, if you engage in active imagination, that is all inner action. And of course, the most interesting thing of inner action in our context is meditation. Effortless awareness, choiceless awareness, accepting something that rises in your mind, not repressing it, and letting it go. Precisely, but gently, without a sense of effort. So meditation is an interesting form of mental action as well, and it ends in not acting. So the question is, could there be an ethics for mental actions? This is green. It must be the pins in here that are broken. So there are two kinds of mental action. Let us just look at mental action. Thinking. You can form a concept. I think about enlightenment. I think about God. All right? That's a mental action. Making a belief your own. That's also mental action. I will believe in this from now on. It sounds good, you know. I make this my own, even if there's maybe no evidence. But then there's something below thinking. For instance, in meditation, you can act with attention. You can concentrate, and then you have what I just described. That's also a form of acting with your own attention in its standard form of spiritual practice. For instance, in mindfulness meditation, right? You would cultivate a choiceless awareness, observe things in your mind, and let them go. Now the point is that there's a single ethical attitude connecting both types of acting. There is something that is similar to both, and I'll close by just pointing these out. In both forms of interaction, you have the unconditional will to truth. The goal always is knowing something, having an insight. It's not believing in something. There is the idea of Wahrhaftigkeit, veracity, so the idea of being absolutely truthful. And the second condition is this is turned not to the world, but it's turned to yourself. So it is the unconditional will to be truthful towards oneself. And in spirituality, the paradigmatic example is, as I just said, the practice of meditation, for instance. Mindfulness meditation. But in the scientific method, a paradigmatical example would be self-critical rationalism. So, what can we say about spirituality and intellectual honesty? I think one thing we can say is, in 2012, I've given you some examples. It's not about believing any of these examples. It's just to see that this is where science and philosophy stands today. That is the present. That's the present moment on the level of theories. One thing we can say, I think, is it's not easy to be intellectually honest. I mean, we can admit this to ourselves. It's not easy in 2012 to face the facts from neuroscience, from modern philosophy of mind. It's emotionally unsettling. We can be very open about it. So there is something like one ethics of interaction, and that you find in spiritual practice and in the ideal of intellectual honesty. And there are two basic forms of acting to get knowledge. One is on the sub-symbolic level in your mind, means acting with attention and mindfulness. And one is on the cognitive level, and in its purest form, this is the scientific, rational method. The only thing I wanted to say tonight is, in this critical historical transition period I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, is we may need both. And ultimately, it may not be possible to have one without the other. And that was all. Thank you very much for your patience.
We've got about half an hour for questions. Well, I saw you. Well, you were first, and then you. Chris, there's two people there.
Yes, first of all, thank you. It was great. I had a question about the opposition of religion and spirituality. I was wondering where you place if I'm not mistaken, the Baptist Church, the American Baptist Church, where they, well, you might say, use their fideism to attain the dissolution of self and those things. Where they speak in tongues or the spiritual healings or the crying and the shivering and isn't this also a form of spirituality, and is there an opposition there? Or?
Well, I think it's a form of deep delusion, and it's also very dangerous in many ways, as we can see in American foreign politics, for instance. Sometimes, this is not something funny. But I think your question is very interesting because it points to a deeper problem. We need to be self-disciplined in any area, for instance, in communal life or so. We need motivation. We need motivation to go on, to do something. And we often get this motivation through some sort of delusional, misbelief. If I only have, then I'll be happy, right? Only that. My master's degree, and then my life will start. Or if I could only manage to really fall in love, then I would be happy, right? And that motivates human beings to go on and go through difficult phases. And I think in this example of the Baptist Church, you can very clearly see how strong the motivating force is of such a belief system. And of course, one question in the background is, the big question I've asked you today, the question I think is actually the most important question in intellectual life is, can there be a secular form of spirituality? Or will there be nothing left? If there's no delusion and, all the scientific facts about the brain, is there something that will go through and survive it? Or will nothing be left? And that would also be dangerous. Because religions have motivated people for centuries. And one thing, to just make an obvious point, you can think about Christianity and Christian theology, whatever you want to say, but one thing you have to admit is that in the last 2,000 years in the West, it created the moral consensus in everyday life, We disagreed about many things all the time. But there's a minimal Christian ethics that allowed social coherence, kept our societies together in everyday life. The question is, what would happen without that? What would happen, for instance, to social cohesion, to the integration of societies? If you ask me, the Christian image of man is already completely dissolved right now. But many people are just beginning to realize that this is gone. Who is going to create, the social integrating force? Neuroscience is not going to do it. So who's going to also create the motivation through a shared system of self-deception? Where is it going to come from? So we might also lose a lot. It's a dangerous situation,
Yes, but is the thing that they do where they go all crazy and what you say it's a delusional state, but isn't it also a form of spirituality because they transcend the self or
do they transcend the self? Do they have insight? Is there knowledge?
Well, I think they claim they do. I'm not sure. I get this, I think, mainly from the movie Jesus Camp. I don't know if you saw it.
Well, the thing is, of course, everybody who has a belief system will claim that they know. And they will claim that it is based on insight. But do we have any reason to believe that? That they have any insight? Speaking in tongues?
What do we have reason to believe that people who meditate have that?
That's a good question. We don't know. That's part of the problem I raised. There are many people who meditate and who claim that they have experienced selfless states, for instance? Is there any reason to believe that? As a philosopher, I can only say it's very problematic to believe that. Imagine somebody, a friend comes to you, you know, something happened to me. Somehow I woke up very early, 3:30 in the morning, and I went for a little walk, and I sat by the forest, and the sun rose, and then suddenly I was not there anymore. And the only thing I can say is this was the most meaningful experience in my whole life, and was very blissful. And I have a kind of knowledge. The first question a philosopher would ask is, so why do you have autobiographical memory of something where you were not there? I mean, that's the first. We call this a performative self-contradiction. How can you report about something where you had no self-consciousness? Unless you have a very good theory or idea, there's no reason to believe somebody who says something like that. It's not part, if the self completely dissolves, it's not part of your life. Right?
Yeah, I have two questions. The first is well, first of all, I admire your attempt to the reconciliation of science and spirituality, but the logical objection in my eyes would be that science concerns objective knowledge, while spirituality is merely subjective. So isn't that a fundamental problem for the reconciliation of the two?
Yeah, I mean, if you would believe that there are two kinds of knowledge involved, then the big question is, of course, what kind of knowledge is that? But there you have the interesting point that most people, where you have some, you know, evidence that they might be advanced, they don't talk. You know, they don't evangelize. So what is common is not that this is one form of knowledge and this is another form of knowledge, but I'm just saying the ethical idea, the value of being really open and honest with oneself, that is what connects both things. It's not a guarantee that there is real knowledge. Also for science, it's not a real guarantee that scientific theories are true. They can always be false.
Well, thank you. That's a helpful answer. Then the second question is about well, you mentioned that the religion was a system of belief which endured for many centuries, while National Socialism and communism didn't have coherent delusional belief systems, so they vanished quite soon. But what about the belief system because in the Western civilization of today, not many people are religious anymore, but we are still, well, yeah. Okay, for the sake of the argument, yeah, but yeah. We are definitely trapped in a belief system, which I think is fair to say that is the capitalist belief system.
Okay.
And what is it that why we all are stuck in that type of belief system? Is it of the delusion that the capitalist theory doesn't tell us that there's life after death, but perhaps it does tell us that we can have as many as we want and we can all become millionaires? Is that the delusional part which sounds nice?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, it's not that old, but it's very effective. And one thing is obvious if you look at this capitalism as a structure, it's really a Darwinistic, an evolutionary structure. So in a certain sense, it maps to our biological past. You know, it's exactly not a civilized way of dealing with each other, but it's more an animal way. And we know that animals are fast and efficient, you know, and that democracy, for instance, are slow and inefficient. Democracies produce the climate catastrophe, for instance. So why do we have this delusion that more growth and more wealth will make us happy? I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to treat this as a delusional system. It's clearly a system of self-deception. There's a lot of scientific research that shows that above 5,000 euros is a lot, but happiness doesn't increase. upper middle class, and then nothing happens and it goes down a little bit because being rich is very stressful.
But the delusion part also goes in principle, of course, because you cannot have exponential growth eternally. So.
Oh, of course, yeah. And I mean, the amazing thing is, just to come back to the very beginning, a related delusional system that right-wing conservative politicians share with left-wing ecological greenies is that we can still do something about the climate catastrophe. If we start doing something now and we work all together, we can still reach the 2-degree goal. That is fully delusional. And many of us share this belief. It's very robust, it's interesting. So maybe there are some structural similarities to religion. I mean, if you were to believe the truth about climate change, you would also suddenly have to realize what you're doing to your children. Or you would have to think about intergenerational justice. I mean, a lot of you are still young in this room. It's going to take another 30 years, And when you're as old as I am, you're going to slowly feel the first effects. We'll probably be gone, the two of us. What the older generation just now does is it exploits the future. We exploit your future. And because you're delusional, you don't realize it, right? And that's, of course, part of a capitalistic strategy.
The next question then.
Yeah, I also have a question. At the beginning you said that spirituality doesn't have a clear goal, or at least there's no consensus about it. But isn't it just happiness, as opposed to science, which has as goal to find truth? Spirituality has as goal to find happiness.
Yeah, that's some people call this wellness spirituality, and many, for instance, of these Buddhist meditation teachers are very concerned about the secularized versions, like mindfulness-based stress reduction in every German psychiatry clinic. You now have secularized versions of meditation, and it helps the patients. And then you have these Buddhist teachers who say, yeah, but it's about liberation. It's not about getting healthy again, there's something more behind. So I think one thing that carries over from religion into spirituality is an ideal of salvation. It is spiritual people don't only want to be happy or more relaxed or healthy, but in a certain sense they want eternal happiness, or go beyond happiness and unhappiness to liberate themselves from the dichotomy. So, in a sense, there is a stronger search for security hidden in many of them. But you could be true. I mean, you could be right. It could just be true that even all the people who don't believe in anything, are not members of churches, organized religions, are individual spiritual practitioners, are just running under the, on the hedonistic treadmill. Just maximize hedonic utility and have a different sexy theory on top of it. It could be true. This could be a result of scientific research. I don't know what it is. Maybe we should have more research about it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question is just a few.
Ik stel hem in het Nederlands, want Engels lukt mij niet.
Okay, you help me.
Welke boeddhistische filosofische stroming vindt u het meest aantrekkelijke voor uzelf? Dus welke boeddhistische filosofische stroming?
Which main Buddhistic philosophy you find most attractive?
Oh, that's difficult. I think none. I don't believe in movements, and I don't believe in labels. Yeah, I mean, as a professional philosopher, I like the tetralemma of Nagarjuna, but that's something analytical. You want to know what tribe or what church. And
that's the right answer.
So I gave the right answer. Okay.
We can look into your brain.
Yeah.
There's a question over there. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Your mentioning of the New Age guys who want to seek enlightenment through Buddhism reminded me of a lecture last year where the lecturer talked about this trend that the religions diffuse from this dogmatic point of view to more like cherry-picking mentality. For example, that no one stones his neighbor for working on the Sabbath, but a little fastening around Easter is cool for everyone. Yeah. So do you see maybe that there's a bridge from this more like specialized individual religious behavior to a more like spiritualistic view like you described it?
I'm not sure if I have fully understood the question. So are you saying that all these individual people that are now existing in the West that don't believe to any cults or churches but just meditate or something are cherry-picking?
Yes, kind of.
That's the idea. Explain. Why do you think?
Basically, like the biblical dogma is like too hard for some people. There are too many like just weird things. Right. But these, even if you see Buddhism as a like complete religion, it's easier to adapt or to adopt as a Westerner. Or basically, if I reformulate it, how would you help the deluded people to come to a more epistemic-based view?
Well, the first question is should one do this? Should one destabilize people who found a solution for themselves in believing something? Maybe it's the best they can do. You know, maybe destroying their belief systems is in itself unethical. There's a question before that. But your question really reminds me, Fred knows it, last week I gave this talk at the Deutsche Buddhistische Union, a place I would not go, but it was very interesting. And the Deutsche Buddhistische Union, all these German Buddhists in Hamburg, they meet, and they are just very interested in secularizing Buddhism. They think, you know, all the mythical stuff has to go, and the pure things must be used in the West, and there are big debates about atheistic Buddhism and everything, Buddhism without belief, Stephen Batchelor. And the interesting thing in the discussion, there were discussions in a big audience, was obviously there's no reason to believe in incarnation. So to be a Buddhist today and know something about neuroscience means to not believe in reincarnation. You should have seen these discussions. Because there were people who say, this takes the spiritual core out of Buddhism. If I'm not allowed to believe in reincarnation anymore, then I would stop being a Buddhist and practicing. Because I want to stop the cycle of birth and death. And other people said, yeah, but it's the first thing that has to go, the belief in reincarnation. And they have these big debates among each other, and they can't settle it. And now, who is cherry-picking? Who is cherry-picking? Those who want to still believe in reincarnation? Or those who would say, no, this has to go?
Mm-hmm. More stuff to think about, yeah. Thank you.
There's a question there in the middle, and then there's the one on the side. But in the middle was first. In the middle, and then...
Is it on? Yes. Thank you, by the way, of talking about social coherence,
right?
Because that was exactly the point that was lacking. At least when you followed the discussion, it somehow disintegrates.
Right.
And I wonder, you've mentioned that the delusional systems have had some kind of a function.
Right.
And the way that you've looked at religion now is, I would say, the fossilized part of it.
Okay.
Isn't there anything that would, be able to help us in the way that a hypothesis in science helps us it may be false, but it helps us at least to make a next step to allow for the possibility of especially things that will stimulate the social coherence. But at the same time, you need to include the willingness to let it go at a certain point. So that I would say religious renewal would be a tautology. Religion should, in that sense, actually be ever renewing, if it would help.
Yeah.
Is that anything?
Well, I think the problem, maybe one can look at it like this. What we would need with these 7 billion people on the planet is global solidarity very fast and very efficiently. But science tells us basically two things. We evolved, in a way, our emotional apparatus evolved that we cannot be solidaric with people than more groups than more than 120 people. Less, tribes. We don't have the emotional apparatus to do that. And the other thing we know is, for instance, if we had to globally act, say, against a climate catastrophe or something like that, what makes human beings act is not information. You all have the information. You're not going to act tomorrow. It's not cognitive insight that there is a crisis. That doesn't change behavior. What makes people act is emotions. So what you would have to do is actually to manipulate the emotions of 7 billion people on this planet very fast to make them change their behavior. That's a horrible thought, right? Nobody wants to do that, to manipulate on a large scale emotions. Nobody wants to do that after our history. So the question is, if there's any way to create, say, a global social cohesion in a crisis situation without creating a new delusion, without emotional manipulation, with what we know about the human brain right now, is that a problem that can be solved? And you seem to say there is some renewing of religion that could solve a problem like that.
I don't know if it will solve it, but as I would say, a hypothesis stemming from spiritual research.
All right.
If you construe my meaning.
Yeah.
I think that would be not unethical.
That would be not unethical.
Yeah. But,
okay. So what is spiritual research? What is that? Can you have a university?
Well, in the sense, I do get the impression that religions have at some point originated from spiritual experience.
Uh-huh.
That's a thesis or a hypothesis.
Shamanism, of course.
But it may, in a certain way, like hypotheses, will help us to advance science. Why couldn't spiritual experience still be fruitful in future developments?
Well, I think they could be fruitful, but there will. You see, the problem today is that there will also be always be a reductionist, and said, yeah, religion evolved out of altered states of mind because shamans ate certain mushrooms or did certain things with plant medicine and had hallucinogenic experiences. And they will say that the people who founded religions were epileptics, basically, who had a temporal lobe epilepsy. They had experiences, and they founded these religions. But there was no knowledge in these experiences. And you always have to counter that critic, who would say, yeah, they had altered states of mind, and very dramatic ones, but how do we know that that was a process of gaining knowledge, right?
But it might not hurt to at least allow people to take their own experiences seriously in that sense, not immediately transfer them to others,
right?
But see them as legitimate experiences that could lead to further development.
Okay, yeah.
We've got 3 more minutes and only one question. So,
no,
who's the lucky one? He's the lucky one.
Thank you for your talk. From evolutionary psychology perspective, is there a good evolutionary theory at the moment to explain why did nature select this neuronal pattern that we become aware of death afterwards, and now we have to deal with that by adopting religious views. So
I don't know. It's just a new challenge. But I can just. Who of you have heard of terror management theory, TMT? Right. So there's a psychological theory that shows that the conviction to your ideological frame of reference varies in strength with your awareness of your own mortality. So the idea in the background is that most cultural achievements, big theories, movements, are basically managing the terror of the insight that you die. And they have these very interesting data and experiments. So say Fred is a real good communist, right? And, they're communists and communists, right? But we too, I know he's hardcore, right? And we both know that. And then I have a scientific questionnaire, and we ask him 100 questions, and we can measure how devoted he is to communism as his religion, right? And we get a value. And then we do exactly the same interview in front of a funeral home with coffins in the background, and the value will get much stronger. You just insert death-related information into the situation. You show dead people or facts about death or a coffin, and you do exactly the same questionnaire. And you will be a much more devoted communist. You can measure it. So the strength of the belief in the system you have chosen as your belief system varies with how much there is what they call death-related information in the currency. That's maybe one approach, that the cultural achievements, the big systems of belief we developed have something to do with managing that fear reaction we had when we suddenly discovered that we are mortal. But, never forget, that is something that I think is very hard for me to understand, even if I know it's true. Evolution had no goal. Evolution had no direction. It's not a scala natura. It's not a ladder that goes up. It goes in all directions. And what is so hard to understand for beings like us is that not only the evolution of our bodies, but also our psychological properties, was result of a process that had no direction and no goal. It's very hard to understand this, and I think that's one of the problems we face today. So
what did you mention the name of that theory, that terror?
TMT, terror management theory.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we must stop now. I want to thank our speaker once more.